Potosi, January 1545. A young Indian herder named Diego Halpa is sheltering from the cold on the slopes of a mountain his people called the Beautiful Mountain. He lights a fire to keep warm. In the morning, he sees something in the ash: silver. The fire had been hot enough to smelt the ore. Within weeks, the Spanish had claimed the mountain. Within a decade, Potosi was one of the largest cities on earth. Bigger than London, bigger than Milan, bigger than anything the Americas had ever seen. The Spanish gave it a name: Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. Emperor Charles V called it the treasury of the world. He was right, and it destroyed him. Here is the question that the forensic record forces you to ask. How does the empire with the most silver in human history go bankrupt, not once, but 4 times under the same king? The official story is that Spain was brought down by military overreach, by endless wars, by incompetent kings spending beyond their means. That story is not wrong, but it is incomplete. The forensic record reveals something stranger and more disturbing, something that challenges the core assumption many of us carry about hard money being the ultimate protection. Spain did not fail because it ran out of silver. It failed because of what the silver did to everything around it, and that mechanism is alive today. Spain in 1545 was already the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. It controlled half of the known world. Its armies were undefeated. Its navy moved treasure across 2 oceans. When Cerro Rico was discovered, it seemed to confirm something the Spanish already believed: that God had given them dominion over the earth. Potosi sits at nearly 15,000 ft above sea level in the Andes of what is now Bolivia. The air is thin. The cold is brutal. At its peak in the early 17th century, the city held over 200,000 people: merchants, priests, prostitutes, slaves, indigenous laborers, Spanish administrators, Genoese bankers, African freedmen. Every language in the known world was spoken there. The mountain produced 60% of the world's silver supply for most of the second half of the 16th century. Between 1545 and 1810, Potosi contributed nearly 20% of all the silver ever mined in human history. The labor that extracted it was human, and it was forced. Under the Midas system, a colonial adaptation of an Inca labor draft, indigenous communities were required to send a portion of their men to work the mines for fixed periods. The conditions were what you would expect of a mercury amalgamation operation at altitude in the 16th century. An estimated 8 million people died in those mines over the colonial period. The silver they extracted made Spain fabulously, historically, incomparably rich, and simultaneously hollowed it out from the inside. There was a priest at the University of Salamanca, known to his students as Dr. Navarus. He was a theologian, not an economist. The word did not yet exist. But in 1556, just 11 years after Cerro Rico was discovered, he published something that should have changed everything. He wrote from direct observation that prices in France were lower than prices in Spain because France had less money than Spain. He wrote that before the Indies were discovered and flooded Spain with gold and silver, labor and goods cost much less than they did now. He wrote that money is worth more where it is scarce and worth less where it is abundant. In 1556, a theologian at a Spanish university had written the quantity theory of money. More money means higher prices, always. Nobody in power listened. Charles V, who had called Potosi the treasury of the world, spent everything it produced and borrowed against everything it would produce. When he died, he left his son Philip a mountain of silver and a mountain of debt. Philip II was called Philip the Prudent. He was meticulous, disciplined, deeply pious, one of the most systematic rulers in European history. He built the first government archive in history and personally reviewed every state document in tiny, precise handwriting. 4 times during his reign, he looked his bankers in the eye and told them the money was not coming, not a renegotiation, not a delay. The most powerful king on earth, sitting on top of the world's largest silver supply, was not going to pay what he owed. The first time was 1557, 1 year into his reign. The 4th time was 1596. By then he signed without hesitation. No deliberation, it was routine. He died in 1598. Spain did it 6 more times in the 65 years after his death, 13 total between 1500 and 1900, the all-time record for a sovereign nation. All of it while the silver was still coming out of the mountain, Now the mechanism. If you understand debasement, you know what it looks like from the inside. The Roman emperors reduced the silver content of the denarius slowly at first, then catastrophically until coins that had been 98% silver contained less than 1%. They debased their way to collapse. Spain did not debase its silver. The silver was real. The coins were pure. The problem was something else entirely. And it is the thing that Dr. Navarus had tried to explain in 1556 before anyone was ready to hear it. When all that silver flooded into Spain first, before it reached France, before it reached England, before it reached the rest of Europe, Spanish prices rose first, Spanish wages rose first, Spanish goods became expensive first. More silver in circulation meant every Spanish worker demanded more coins for his labor because everything around him cost more coins. The cloth a Spanish weaver made cost more silver to produce and therefore more silver to buy. The Dutch weaver with far less silver in his economy charged far less. Same cloth, same quality, Spanish price higher. Not because Spain made it better, simply because Spain had too much money. Spanish merchants could not compete, so they stopped competing. Why make cloth when you can buy it? Why build ships when you can hire the Dutch to build them? Why develop industry when the mountain will pay for everything? The silver did not stay in Spain. It flowed straight through. To pay for the imported goods Spain was now buying instead of making. To pay the Genoese bankers their interest. To pay the German and Dutch merchants running the trade Spain had abandoned. One French traveler passing through in 1603 wrote a phrase that has survived 4 centuries. Everything is dear in Spain except silver. Spain had become a conduit. The treasure of the New World passed through Spanish hands into the hands of everyone else. Economists now have a name for this mechanism. They call it Dutch disease. Coined in 1977 when the Netherlands discovered North Sea natural gas and watched its manufacturing sector collapse as the currency strengthened and imports became cheaper than domestic production. The name is ironic given what we are discussing because the Dutch did not get Dutch disease from Spain's silver. Spain did. There was a group of Spanish writers and economic reformers called the arbitristas. They sent the crown lengthy analyses, what we would today call policy papers, warning exactly what was happening. Royal expenditure must be regulated. The tax system must be overhauled. The nation's humiliating dependence on foreigners, on the Dutch and the Genoese, must be brought to an end. Castile's productivity must be restored. Domestic industry must be rebuilt. The crown received the papers, acknowledged the arguments, and did nothing because the mountain was still producing. Because there was always another loan to negotiate. Because the next galleon fleet from Acapulco would solve the problem until it didn't. By the early 17th century, Potosi's production was beginning to slow. The richest veins had been worked. The mountain that had once produced 60% of the world's silver was producing less each decade. The pressure on the royal treasury intensified, and somewhere inside the Potosi Mint, the facility that converted raw silver into the 8 real coins the world trusted as its reserve currency, someone decided to take advantage of that trust. It started with the assayers, the men whose legal responsibility was to certify the silver content of every coin. Coins were supposed to contain 93 parts silver per 100 as decreed by King Philip IV in 1642. The assayers began producing coins with less, not much less at first, enough to pocket the difference, enough that each batch of coins yielded a quiet profit nobody would notice. It spread. The assayers brought in partners. The partners brought in officials. The officials brought in their supervisors. The plot eventually corrupted. By one historian's estimate, nearly every official within 1,000 miles of Potosi, even the Viceroy of Peru, was suspected. By 1638, debased coins from Potosi were circulating in world markets. By the early 1640s, merchants from Boston to Beijing were rejecting them. The piece of 8, the world's first global reserve currency, accepted from the markets of Seville to the ports of Canton, had become a coin that no serious merchant would take at face value. Philip IV finally dispatched an investigator in 1648. His name was Francisco de la Rocha, a former inquisitor. He arrived in Potosi at the end of that year. He did not take long. Within months, he had unraveled the entire network. The key figures were Francisco Gomez de la Rocha, a former mayor of Potosi, and Juan Ramirez de Arellano, the chief assayer, the man whose literal job had been to guarantee the purity of the coins the world trusted. Both were executed by strangulation in December 1649. Over 100 other individuals were punished. The fraudulent coins, which had come to be called rochunas, named for Rocha, the executed mayor, were devalued by royal decree. An 8-real coin that had circulated at full value was now worth 6 reals. A 4-real coin became worth 3, but the damage was done. Philip IV could execute the assayers. He could devalue the coins. He could introduce a new design in 1652 that stamped the assayer's name in 3 separate places so fraudulent coins could be traced. What he could not do was restore the trust. The world's reserve currency, the coin that had lubricated trade from the Caribbean to China for over a century, had been revealed as something that could be debased from the inside by the people entrusted to protect it. The numismatic historian Jesse Croft of the American Numismatic Society documented that the fraud had a direct influence on the monetary history of the British North American colonies. They were forced to develop alternative monetary systems because Spanish silver could no longer be trusted. The most trusted coin in the world had been corrupted not by a king's decree, not by war, but by the people inside the mint who were supposed to be its guardians. Here is where the Roman comparison becomes exact. The Roman emperors debased the denarius openly by decree because they needed money to pay armies. It took 2 centuries for the silver content to fall from 98% to nearly nothing. The mechanism was visible if you weighed the coins and compared them to older ones. Spain did something different. Spain's coins were not officially debased. They were secretly debased by the people entrusted to guarantee their purity. The mechanism was identical. Less silver per coin than the face value claimed. But the origin was corruption rather than decree. The result was the same. The world stopped trusting the money, and the empire that depended on that trust had no reserve left to draw on. Now, who survived? The Spanish experience was not a total collapse. It was a slow extraction, wealth draining from Spain into the hands of those who understood what the silver could not do for you. The first group who preserved wealth were the Genoese banking families. The Grimaldi family participated in 27 separate loan contracts with the crown between 1566 and 1589. The Spinola family participated in 98. These families lent to Philip II, absorbed write-downs during each default, and kept lending. Because the interest rates were extraordinary and because they understood something Philip did not. They were not trying to hold silver. They were trying to control the flow of silver. Whoever sits between the resource and the market extracts value from both sides. Today, the equivalent is not a Genoese banking house. It is anyone who controls distribution infrastructure rather than owning the underlying resource, the oil refiner rather than the oil driller, the payment processor rather than the currency issuer. The second group were the Calvinist craftsmen and merchants who fled Spanish-controlled territories during the Dutch Revolt. They did not leave with land, with mines, or with royal monopolies, the assets Spain considered wealth. They left with skills. When they reached Amsterdam and the northern provinces, they built the Dutch Golden Age, the Dutch East India Company, the first publicly traded joint stock company in history, the financial infrastructure that replaced Spain as the center of world trade. Their value could not be confiscated. It could not be inflated away. It crossed borders in their hands and in their heads. Today, the modern equivalent is portable human capital, skills, professional networks, knowledge, credentials that function regardless of what any single government does to its currency. The Calvinist weavers of Flanders understood this without knowing the theory. They moved and they built something Spain could not touch. The third group were the landowners and producers in Spain's coastal periphery, those with genuine productive capacity that did not depend on the silver-funded imperial system. The regions that suffered most during Spain's decline were Castile and the interior, entirely dependent on what the crown provided. The coastal regions, which could trade directly and had working agricultural and fishing economies, adapted. This is the same lesson the Roman record shows, and the same lesson every currency crisis in history confirms. The person with productive capacity that functions regardless of what the currency does has something the person holding financial promises does not. Today, the modern equivalent is income-producing assets, a rental property, a small business, farmland. anything that generates value through a mechanism separate from the monetary system's functioning. If it works when the currency works, and also when it doesn't, it is worth more than something that only works when the currency does. The fourth and most counterintuitive lesson concerns the juros. These were royal debt instruments, essentially Spanish government bonds. When silver flooded in, the wealthy elite of Spain invested their money in juros rather than in productive enterprise. The return was guaranteed by the crown. Why build a factory when the king pays you interest? Why develop trade networks when the treasury covers everything? The crown defaulted 13 times. The juro holders were wiped out repeatedly. They had chosen the king's promise over productive capacity. The promise failed. The land, the skills, the trade routes, those remained. Today, the equivalent question is the same one the arbitristas were asking in 1580. When the system that backs a promise starts to strain, what is the promise actually worth? A government bond is a promise. So is a pension. So is Social Security. So is any financial instrument whose value depends on an institution's continued willingness and ability to pay. The Spanish juros were the safest investment in the world in 1560. The history of what happened next is on record. The United States today is not Spain. Let that be clear. The comparison is a warning about a mechanism, not a prediction of an outcome. But the mechanism is the same. The United States issues the world's reserve currency. This means the world needs dollars to conduct trade, which means the U.S. can run trade deficits without immediate consequence, which means it becomes cheaper to import than to manufacture domestically. American manufacturing's share of the economy has fallen from 28% in 1953 to roughly 11% today. The jobs that built the middle class moved to China, to Mexico, to Vietnam, because the reserve currency made imports cheap and domestic production relatively expensive. Spain's silver made Spanish goods uncompetitive. The dollar's reserve status made American manufacturing uncompetitive. The mechanism is not identical, but it rhymes. Spain had economists, the arbitristas, who diagnosed the problem clearly and were ignored. The United States has had economists warning about deindustrialization and reserve currency dependency for decades. The reception has been the same. Spain's wealthy elite invested in juros rather than factories because the guaranteed return was too attractive. American capital has flowed into financial engineering and treasury bonds for 40 years for the same reason. Why build something when the yield is lower than what the government pays? In Spain's reserve currency, the piece of 8 was the most trusted coin in the world until the people inside the mint debased it in secret for 30 years. The question worth sitting with is not whether this is happening. It is whether you are positioned for the moment the world notices. The Potosi mint fraud was detected in 1648. The coins had been circulating since 1638, 10 years of debased coins in global markets before the investigation was even launched. Merchants in Boston and Beijing had already stopped accepting them. The trust had already broken. The decree came after. It usually does. The forensic record of the Spanish Empire points toward the same conclusion the Roman record points toward, and the Argentine record, and every other case examined. The lesson of Potosi was not written by Philip II. It was not written by the arbitristas, whose warnings filled the archives. It was written by the Genoese bankers who controlled the flow of silver without ever touching a mine. By the Calvinist weavers who crossed into Amsterdam with their skills and built what Spain's silver could not, a productive empire. And by the 8 million people whose labor produced the treasure that enriched everyone except them. They understood, each in their own way, what the richest empire on earth spent 2 centuries failing to learn. The silver was never the wealth. It was only what you could do with it. And what you could do with it depended entirely on what you had built before you needed it. If this forensic breakdown changed the way you look at the economic forces shaping our world today, please subscribe and like the channel. We are digging up the history that they have tried to bury. Plant the seeds for your future. The next treasure of knowledge will be open soon.